Hello, everyone. Welcome to Curious K podcast. And this is another interesting episode. And I'm very excited today because it promises to be a very interesting conversation. And as you know, on Curious K podcast, this is a show where we have amazing conversation with entrepreneurs, ecosystem enablers, and the goal of this is just to showcase uh, unique African startup. I mean, what is happening on the African continent, and everybody working to make impact on the continent. On today's show, we are having a very interesting entrepreneur. He is one of the veteran in the Nigerian tech ecosystem. Uh, he's been building stuff. He's also been supporting entrepreneurs. So he's working on both sides of the con. He's also an investor, and he goes by the name of Josh Okpata. And I'm very excited to have him on the show today. Josh, thank you for joining us on Curious K podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Colabo.
Yeah, you're welcome. So how are you doing today? How is it going?
Great. The weather is good. For the first time, it's been a little cold. So for the first time, there was enough sun for me to sit on my balcony and just grab all of the missing vitamin C, vitamin D that had been lacking. So it felt really good. It feels really good. It's been a good day.
Nice. Happy to hear that. Yeah, so let's get into it, Josh. All right. I know you've been building startups, supporting startup for years now. So let's just get to know your background. How did it start for you? What was the journey like building startup or running businesses?
Yeah, thank you. That's a good question because it lets me rejig my memory. Um, and so I'm gonna say my first experience, business of any kind, was actually in the university. And so I was in my, I think, third year, second year or third year, I don't recall at the time, but I had taken a course on, I had gone into like Cisco networking. I had done a couple of courses. I was doing a course on certified ethical hacking. And I thought I was going to try to set up a company that was into information security, try to provide network management that would guarantee like the fidelity and security of information, so because the security process starts from like the design, the management of the network, and of course, like, license penetration testing, all of that stuff. So I set up a small, it was an unregistered business. I could call it a consultancy. The name was Cyberfort. I did, I got a couple of business projects with it. We did even at some point dabble into a bit of reputation management with like digitally for a few, you know, people of note, including at the time, we got a project with the Nigerian National Orientation Agency and NAFDAC, and a boxer whose name is Bashali, and stuff like that. So that was my first exposure to the world of business. It was okay, but at the same time, it wasn't like structured, and I was a teenager at the time. It did bring a bit of money, but then because of the lack of structure, it was hard to compete for projects. It was hard to gain trust, and so, eventually, I wouldn't say the business died. It did fizzle out eventually, but I wouldn't say it died because it was a starting point for my experience, exposure to business. It brought many valuable lessons. And then after school, I worked for a bit. I did engineering projects in the US and in Nigeria. And then I started, co-founded a company called Eazyhire. I was CEO of Eazyhire for 4 or 5 years. And in that time, we're venture backed, so we raised a bit of money, but we were an asset financing. We started as a rental company, trying to create a platform, an environment for people to be able to make peer-to-peer rental transactions happen. So I have this stuff, I underutilize it. I want that person to have it, and pay me a fee for it. And so we try to facilitate some of these transactions. We did a sizable amount, but because of like the imminent risks in the that line of business in Nigeria, somebody borrows a camera, returns it broken or gets missing, the accountability system wasn't really in place. So we had to shelve the peer-to-peer method or peer-to-peer process, at least in Nigeria and Kenya. We had to shelve it for a more B2B approach and for heavier stuff, so vehicles, heavy equipment, and that's what Eazyhire was doing all the way until when I stepped down as CEO. The company, of course, one of the advantages of some of the lessons I learned from my previous life was at this point I had come to understand structure, and so my co-founder and I we built a team that was able to stand on its own. And so stepping down, because we also need to understand that entrepreneurship is a career like any other career. I mean, for some it's a life path, but for others it's a career. And so at some point I thought I've done some work in this space. I'm interested in working with entrepreneurs, but on the flip side. And so I resigned as CEO, of course, into the able hands of the existing structure. I do still, support and remain a director, but the degree of my involvement is no longer executive. And on the other side of things, working with startups in an advisory support capacity is eye-opening, because then you see or you come to realize what it feels like being considered an investor. In this part of the world, I mean, in Africa, there's a there's some bittersweet relationship that investors have with startups. The investor says, "Hey, send your report," and you go back and forth as a founder. Like, this guy is stressing me, or this woman is stressing me too much. What have you done this month? How can we help you? It gets tiring. But eventually, when you're on the other side of things, when you're on the investment side of things, you then understand why these things are important, right? But I would also say that being a founder for all the years I was, running Eazyhire for, provided valuable lessons. So as an investor, both as an angel investor or as a portfolio manager with and venture partner with Mest, I was able to find middle ground between providing support to the founders and the startups, but also empathizing with their perspective and understanding and taking their needs for what they were and not trying to force anything on them. So, I mean, I did support over 60 startups. Hopefully, they consider me a good, resource to work with. But that's been the journey up until more. I mean, I've been a partner at Lab 8. It's a venture capital fund. It's a new fund and an accelerator out of Toronto. I've done quite a bunch of things, but
Yeah.
currently I'm on the innovation team with the United Nations World Food Program. So yeah, that's my background in quite a large nutshell.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Josh. And so let's go back a bit. I would like to talk about Eazyhire when you started. What was the why for you? I mean, why did you think Eazyhire was the business for you to start then? And what was the process for you validating that idea? And I would just like to talk about that. And at a point, I know you had some issues with a clone, of the business some years back. And I
Mm.
mean, I would just like you to talk more about on the
Yeah.
experiences, some of the issues. I mean, the low points when you were building Eazyhire.
Yeah. So I mentioned that before I started Eazyhire, I was working as an engineer and working on construction projects. If you work on construction projects in Africa or in Nigeria, I did come to realize that there was a huge disparity between the available equipment to carry out, because when you're doing construction, whether it's you're grading roads or you're building bridges or whatever, you need cranes, you need um, bulldozers, graders, all that stuff. And so I realized there was a huge disparity between what was available and what was required. The infrastructure deficit in Africa is really high, especially in Nigeria. The equipment, however, to make these things happen, the available ones are either very few or not really functional. And so that inspired in some way. Of course, I always like to say that the idea was divinely inspired, but this was like the product of my experience as well, with regards to renting equipment. And so I thought, instead of starting with heavy stuff, why don't we first of all start with everyday things? Because you also realize that people rent everyday things a lot, or people would like to rent everyday things a lot. And so we did like a quick market research. Um, I had a co-founder at the time, and we went into, I mean, not a co-founder initially, a friend, because the business wasn't even incorporated then. And we went into Yaba, went into Surulere. I personally took questionnaires, flyers. I was asking random people, are there things you borrow, to make your life easier, better? How much you pay for these things? So I did this for like a couple weeks, months, and with all the feedback that we had, we felt okay. Well, we think there's room for a viable business where people can share stuff that they own for other people to rent. So that was the genesis of Eazyhire. Of course, eventually, because of the risks I spoke about, we had to transition majorly to B2B, like heavy duty rentals, and eventually asset financing, which the business mostly focuses on now. In terms of the case of plagiarism, um, that was an interesting story because we were at
Yeah,
Idea Hub. We were at Idea Hub at the time. I believe you're conversant with that period. I think this
yeah.
was 2015 or so, or it took 2015, 2016. I'm not sure now. And so I was in South Africa, and somebody on the team emailed me or texted me or something and said, "Hey Josh, there's this. I mean, you need to take a look." And I see there's some guys who are using the exact same name, Easy Hire, but with the S, because we're using the Z, um, and same color, like palettes, same patterns. So where we use blue, they use blue. Where we use black, they use black. The same. So our tagline at the time was, I don't recall, but let's say our tagline was 1, 2, 3. Just a random example. Theirs was 3, 2, 1. Like literally, just switch it back. It was crazy
That's
because
true.
like it was insane. And at the time, I didn't know what to do. So when I came back, I went to speak with Helen Anatogo. She was the CEO of Idea Hub at the time. I know she had legal experience with Microsoft, so I spoke to her and she was like, "Look, there's no point suing and all of that. Let's see if we can drag these people, have like a media bleeds and drag them and see how that fares." And so I remember the first people I spoke with were TechPoint. Diwali at the time, they were still, their office was at Idea Hub. So they were gracious. They gave me an interview. We spoke about it. They did an article, which is probably still up, and asked me questions. And the funny part was we did our research. We went to check for who those people were. We couldn't pin them to an office. We couldn't pin them to anything. The only thing we could pin them to was somebody who had come as an intern for like a kind of like a visit at Idea Hub to come and see all the companies, along with a smaller team from, I don't know, whatever university or program they came with. He was one of them, part of them. I don't remember his name now. But so the whole the way we drew it up eventually, because it was a nameless, ghostless competitor. I mean, sorry, ghost-faced competitor, and we didn't know who. So, but that was the person we could draw a nexus to and say, well, we think this is the guy. Eventually, I mean, it seems they also gave their own side of the story, and so we did a couple media, whatever, media rounds. We realized at some point that they were in some incubator in a university in the Southwest. We wrote to the university and said, "Hey, do you know these guys? This is what they're doing." Because we had our proof. We had been registered since, like, they were not even incorporated. We were incorporated in 2015. We had been registered the website since 2014. Well, look, I'm not gonna lie to you. That took its toll on us, and I don't think, as a name, as a brand for what we were trying to accomplish, I don't think we ever really recovered. Sometimes people do certain things and they don't understand the implication of what they did. Somebody's trying to grow a business. We're working really hard, building solid relationships. We had international clients, and sometimes these international clients, because at the same time, because we only had the Z, these clients will send us emails and put mistakenly use an S instead of the Z in the initial days of the transactions, and emails will go to the wrong people. And instead of those people to say, "Hey, we don't know what this is about," to respond and try to take the business. It cost us a lot, in many ways, and it affected the brand capital in a way that I don't think the brand ever really recovered from. But that's a story from another day.
Yeah. So what was like the key lessons for you then? I mean, do you think using simple names, starting a business is better than
Mm,
trying to use, some other, for you it was easy, like Eazy, right?
yeah,
But these
yeah,
guys were doing Easy, the way you
yeah,
actually want to spell it. So what were
yeah,
those lessons? Do you think those were some of the things you learned in
yeah.
trying to like register or start up?
Hmm. Um, First of all, I'd say after that experience, we went and bought all the possible domains that links to us: S, Z, C in Nigeria and Kenya and Ghana and South Africa. At the point, our domain bill was almost up to $500 or $1,000 every year. So we bought a lot of domains. That was the first lesson. The second thing though is I think it's important. Naming conventions, like how you name your business when you're starting, is very, very important. That was an important lesson learned, but not just in the way you name your business, but in the way you protect the name of your business and your intellectual capital. These are super, super important lessons. And going forward from that experience, we realized that the brand is as important as the business itself. How it is when you get a new idea, you just want to run with it. You've never
Yeah.
you really think of the details and all of that. And so it's when you get hit with challenges, you then start to reflect and say, maybe we should have done this. But I guess those were the two important lessons that we learned and we tried to implement for the rest of the time. Of course, I should just chip in here and say the regulatory legal framework can be better. We tried to write um, NERA at the time and say, hey, these people are passing up on our business. They're using the wrong, like they were using it, does NG as well. Why don't you do something about it? We've provided all the evidence, and they say you need a court order, and you go to court, and court is going to take 5, 6 years. So, I mean, it's tiring, but these are some of the things. I know I'm jumping the gun, but a proper startup bill will address protection for technology companies in many respects. But I don't know if we're even there yet.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is very interesting, right? Right now we have over 600 orbs or Africa. I think there are quite a number of incubation programs, accelerator programs, startup programs, and I think it's important for us to start documenting case studies like this because this is a lesson that I think will has the potential to stand the test of time, right? And hubs, for example, startup programs need to start talking about case studies like this. And we should be using relevant examples in our ecosystem, right? Not just every time we want to do something, we start talking about Uber, start talking about Google. This is very practical. This is real. And people still planning to start businesses or run startups. I mean, there's still potentials that they can still fall into traps like this. So I
Mhm.
think I mean, this is very interesting. And having this conversation with you, I just think we need to start building case studies
Yeah.
about startup in our ecosystem and look for a way to actually make this knowledge, this information available for everyone in that space working to make entrepreneurship thrive. Josh, thank you very much for sharing that. So let's move to how you evolved your role from building Easy Hire to now supporting startups. I mean, portfolios at Mest. Uh,
Yeah.
because I mean, you're building stuff, right? You're building a startup. I mean, why did you decide that you just want to step down as the CEO, right, and move on? What was it like making that kind of decision for you at that point?
Yeah, this is also an important question because I think that when you have one of the initial conversations I had when I was starting Easy High was with a friend, I mean a mutual friend. He's Ahmed of Gigale, and he told me something about the trajectory of a business of a startup. You can be building for the now, or you can be building for the long term. And when you determine which approach you want to take, that will influence a lot of the decisions you make in the line of the business, right? And so very early in the day, I figured out that what I wanted to build was a business that would be sustainable. Initially, we got caught up in the buzz, I do this, the fundraising frenzy, all of that. But at some point, I sat back and my co-founder and I, we spoke and we really reflected. And we remembered one of the reasons this business was started was for longevity. You want a business that will last the test of time. And when you start to think about it in this way, you realize that there's nothing wrong in building at your own pace. There's nothing wrong in building slowly. There's nothing wrong in growing organically. And with all of these things, I did realize if you're going to build for the future, you're not going to be there forever. So it's important that you set up a structure. I mentioned that entrepreneurship is a career like any other career, even though some people dedicate their lives to it, and that's fine. For me, it was a career, right? I want to do this. I want to set this up. Success for me, the milestone for success for me was to leave infrastructure that could stand on its own. And I felt like when I had reached that mark, I wanted to transition from there. And then the transition is also important because I realized, like you were just saying a moment ago, a lot of the people in our startup ecosystem are building blindly. The only lessons they get from people who have tried to build stuff in Africa are on Twitter or at symposia or forums that last 30 minutes, an hour. That's not really enough context if you're new to building in Africa. And so I thought, I might not have done, all the amazing things in the world, but from the experiences I've gotten trying to build a business in Africa, because building a business in Nigeria is really tough. And there are things that nobody can teach you except if that person has tried his or her hands at it. Right. And I thought there's a lot of people who are building blind. Why don't I try to support more people who are trying to start their own businesses with context? And that was the inspiration for my transition, really, because I know, like, nobody is going to tell you that when you're doing business in Nigeria, how do you budget for kickbacks? I mean, it's not to be said, right? But the truth is, it's Nigeria. These things will arise. How do you know that in registration they will say it will take 2 weeks, but it will take 2 months? Or how do you know that when you apply for a license, you need to know somebody on the inside? And just beyond these things, the entire concept of building in and for Nigeria is not something you learn on Twitter. It's not something you learn, um, you know, randomly. It's something you learn from the experiences of people who have tried to do this. And not just me, if there are more people like me who have tried to build businesses, regardless of how that fared, and who are sharing their experiences with other startups, I think we would have a more robust ecosystem, because the failure rate for startups is still over 90%, 90 something percent. But when you share experiences, when you give people greater context, it gives them a better chance of succeeding. So that was the bulk of my work at Mest. You sit with a portfolio. There's so many people trying to do so many brilliant ideas. Sometimes you look at ideas and this is a brilliant idea, but the same direction they're taking could be a pitfall for them. And you tell them, and you save them 3-4 years of unnecessary hard work, right? And so these are the kind of things I was doing, and I did it for a bit, and I found fulfillment in it. And after doing it for Mest, I thought, you know what, I want to do it on a larger scale. And so I feel very fulfilled continuing to support like programs that are designed for startups and amazing entrepreneurs across the world with the UN. And I think it feels very rewarding for me, because you're saving these people time, and by extension, you're allowing them create even greater value and have even better impact in probably a shorter time. So I think that's the value of the work that I currently do.
That's absolutely great. And I would also like us to talk about funding in the ecosystem, right? Eazyhire was venture backed, right? How
Yeah.
was it like for you raising funds at that time?
Mhm. Mhm.
Uh, how can you compare that to how funding is like right now in the ecosystem? What do you think has been happening in terms of growth?
Mhm.
I would just like to learn from you in terms of perspective around that.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, everybody knows that right now it's crazy out there, and it's a good thing. There's a lot more funding. It's still terrible. As it like I was looking at reports some months earlier in the year, some months ago, and I realized that the amount of venture capital that comes into Africa is still under 2% of the venture capital allocation to the rest of the world. Yeah, I do understand that. However, it's many, many times much better than it was, in 2015 or 2014. And that's growth. It's not the most efficient way to grow. It's not the fastest kind of growth that we've seen, but at the same time, it's growth, and I'm grateful for that. I mean, now people raise, first of all, when people talk about seed rounds these days, you're talking about like 100,000 plus. In 2014, 2015, the only people who would even come close to those numbers would be like maybe YC and 500 startups.
Yeah.
But now it's much easier. Like everybody like 100, nobody even raises 100K anymore. I see people do pre-seeds of like, in the millions, and that's good for the ecosystem because the availability of resources to build, makes it somewhat easy. I mean, not easier in terms of the implementation of the operation, but just easier to get the right talent, and acquire the resources you need to grow. That's fine. But compared to back then, you really had to grind your way through. I can be Easyhire raised 3 rounds of funding between 2015 and 2019. I can assure you that we sent out, we had over 1,000 investor meetings in the course of those 4 years. The most of them being in the first 2 years. But what happened was after the first 2 years, we did realize that we needed to slow down, right? Because we were doing numbers. Because of the nature of our business, it was pretty it was asset heavy, and so we had numbers to build on. And so we told ourselves, well, maybe you don't have to jump into the rush of trying to raise a lot of money. Maybe you should just keep growing your revenue. And it worked for us. We did that, and we got the other last 2 rounds we raised were from investors who we just had like reasonable conversations with and said we're going to back you, and we were even able to determine the terms to a large extent of the investment, how much we wanted to give away, and because of how much we needed at the time. So I think now, again, it's a much better climb. It can still be better, but it's a much better climb than what it was. I think, though, my point to startups here would be don't get carried away by the buzz. Only raise money if you need it. Raising money is not a metric for success. It's not necessarily a metric for success if you know what you're doing. And it puts a lot more pressure on you. So the fact that there's easier money to raise doesn't mean that you have to raise it if you don't have a need for it. And then to people who will find it challenging to raise money, because it's still very challenging, maybe not as much as before. I mean, I remember the first investor who reached out to us in 2015 and said, oh, they wanted to invest in 20% of the business. And we're so happy. And we got on the call, and what they were offering was $15,000, And so now I would, I mean, I'm sure startups would be excused if they hung up on such a call today in today's terms. But the point still being, there are still bottlenecks to raising, right? And so the strategy is usually build relationships. I always tell people, founders, because at Mest we also used to invest in some sense. I always tell founders, investment, like many other things, is an emotional decision. The people who are putting money in, they are human beings. Yes, they will ask you for numbers and metrics, but at the end of the day, especially for early stage businesses, like if you're less than 3 years old, you don't really have anything to show, right? I don't care, like except if you're 0 to 2 years, except if you're doing like remarkable numbers, which truly many people are not doing. Because even if you have 1 million users, we forget that the basics of business is you buy for like the cost of the money you make from what you buy should be more than what you spent acquiring, that item that you're selling or that service that you're selling.
Yeah.
So many people, even with 1 million, 10 million users, they've not breached that benchmark yet. So people are just investing on the basis of, well, I think these people can succeed. Emotional decision. Oh, I like the team. Emotional decision. I like the strength of the idea. Emotional decision. So it's important to build relationships, right? If you're trying to raise money, it's very important to build relationships. Of course, have the work ethic and all that, but don't just shooting cold emails to 100 investors. It might be productive, but it will not be as productive as starting to email updates of your company. Have a list of investors, email them updates every week or every month, every quarter. I don't know how frequently people report these days. Send it to them. It will build up to a crescendo where you then say, well, we're looking to raise money in the next quarter. You've already established a pattern of information. And even if they don't feel like you're there yet, they'll say, well, maybe we can give these people a chance, or maybe we can bet on them because they've shown accountability so far. And that's the emotional decision I speak about. So just so I'm not quoted wrongly, I'm not saying investment is purely an emotional decision, but emotional, your human or your humanity plays a huge role in who people decide to invest in, which is why people will invest in their friends many times over than they will invest in strangers, which is why we complain that the same set of startups are raising more money than everybody else, not because they're going to be the most successful in the future, but because people can vouch for them, people know them, people have relationships with them, and those are the things that people are investing in.
if you can tell us briefly about your work at UN now, and then we can talk about the Nigerian startup bill. As of now, I don't think the draft is out yet. And I know you mentioned earlier in the conversation about legal framework that can help startups. So
Yeah.
first of all, share with us about your work at UN now. Then let's move to the Nigerian startup bill.
Yeah. First of all, I have to say that I do not speak in any way on behalf of the UN or my team at the UN. I speak in an individual capacity, but I do work on the innovation team at WFP. And so essentially, we're trying to solve issues around hunger, primarily issues around hunger, but gradually we're also starting to expand the nets to cover more SDGs. So
Okay, you
working with
said WFP. Can you
World Food
clarify?
Program, yeah.
Okay, all right.
So yeah, that's fine. Expanding the net to include more SDGs. Trying to work with the private sector, public sector, governments, and all of that to enable ideas and innovation around solving hunger. So we want to make the world a place where people have food to eat. As basic as it sounds, it's a huge problem. And the WFP does incredible work in this regard. I mean, I do recommend everybody should look them up. They feed hundreds of millions of people across the world every year, especially in conflict zones and all of that. But having said that, I think I'm going to bring it home to Nigeria and talk about the startup bill that's being mulled or discussed, mulled over. I had a meeting like 5 months ago, maybe. But I mean, I'm not sure it was 5 months, but I think it was 5 months. I'll need to confirm. And in that meeting, I was invited to that meeting along with a couple of other stakeholders. I don't know what the criteria for invitation was, but I got a message. And in that meeting, there was a room of maybe, I don't know, 20 people, 20 something people. And it was a meeting with the DG of the NITDA and his team. It was organized by, I mean, I think the information is out there. The point I'm trying to make here is I strongly, and this is in best faith, but still, I strongly question the integrity of the institutions, behind the potential adoption and implementation of the bill. And when I mean institution, I don't mean the private institutions, I mean the government institutions. The reason being, at that meeting, a lot of good things were said. The point of the meeting was bring stakeholders together. There were lots of prominent names or faces. I don't want to start calling names. They spoke really well. They offered very valuable insight. And at the end of the day, they took notes and said, well, we're going to reach out to you guys with the feedback. And that was the end of it. All I know is a few months later, they came up with the proposal of a tax, like trying to tax startups or some stuff like that. Everything that was the exact opposite of what had been said at that meeting, right? And so I know I have questioned the integrity of the government in handling some of these things over the years, but this was a more personal experience, which is what makes me feel that when a country doesn't have the political will, exercises like this, not being pessimistic, but they are often exercises in futility. Regardless, on the merits of the bill, I think there's a lot of positives in it. I think that it will definitely help, and these were my proposals at the meeting, to have some legal protection for startups. For example, setting up a startup court, right? Or a court that caters to technology startups or entrepreneurs. Reason for this is the legal process in Nigeria on the average is very expensive. It's long drawn out, right? If you're going to sue somebody for something, it will take you so many years and so much. I remember one time Eazyhire got into arbitration, and every sitting we're paying 500,000. Either 500,000 or 250,000 every sitting. How many startups can afford that? So one of the things I proposed was a special court that addresses technology company related matters, protects our interest as well, because you can always go there and get justice, whether it's from big companies owing you and refusing to pay, because that's also another thing that takes startups under. Lots of startups are in debt. A lot of startups are dealing with the big fish, small fish syndrome. So you're a tech startup, you want to blow, so you get a big client on your roster, and you're so happy. Okay, it's time to pay. That's a problem, right? And they owe you an ending because they know you can't do anything, and you needed them because you wanted it to be said that you've done business with X or Y. So more protection is needed for this industry, the startup and tech industry, because a lot of jobs are being generated. But also, I spoke about taxation, and there's a lot of accusations of multiple taxation across the different climes where startups do business in Lagos, I mean Nigeria especially. Startups are having to pay for this, pay for that, and I think these things can be streamlined and make it convenient. The government will tell you there's a tax break for 2 years or for 3 years first if you start a new business in this line, blah blah blah. It is a lie. You try to implement it and see it doesn't work. The tax people will be at your door from day one. Like, tax people, I've come to my office before in Yaba, and the tax people were there before me, waiting for me. Like, what kind of behavior is that? Can't you at least wait for me to settle in? We're talking of a 1.5-year-old business. And it's not even like they don't have no paperwork, no documentation, no proof of anything, just vibes. Okay, we think you are owing this. How? Why? Nothing. So, I mean, the challenges are major, but I think a startup bill in principle um, is useful. Some of the components of this current bill that are being bandied around are also helpful in the long run. However, my issue is, with the implementation. But I mean, I'm still willing to give them the benefit of the doubt, but I will not be holding my breath.
All right. Thanks, Josh. Always good to have a different perspective in terms of how this can be done. I just hope. I mean, because I think I've been to like two, three different sessions about the startup bill, and I'm just very hopeful about the outcome. And let's see how that can impact the startup ecosystem in Nigeria. So, as we round up, is there anything you'd like to tell us or talk about or share?
Hmm. Um, I mean, this question kind of feels like when you meet a partner, a potential partner, and you guys are talking about your lives in the past, and
Yeah.
she's like, is there really anything you haven't said yet? But I think what I would say is it's important as well that people are allowed, number one, to make mistakes, and number two, are not uh, I don't want to say judged by their mistakes. Because you see, there's a lot of lessons we can learn. The biggest, like whether it's in India, whether it's in Berlin and the US, Silicon Valley, the biggest tech ecosystems are built on the lessons of the mistakes that so many of the predecessors made, right? But in Nigeria, it doesn't really work because we castigate and we make life hard for people who make or try to share their mistakes. And that's a challenge. No industry grows like that. No sector grows like that. So I think the point I'm trying to make here, or my parting words, would be for the tech ecosystem in Nigeria to make it conducive for people to share their lessons, because there's a lot of people who have learned so much and who have been through so much. Many of these success stories we celebrate now were paved, or the ways were paved by people who went ahead, who might not necessarily have succeeded, but who
Yeah.
made such a dent, or such a mark in the process that it was possible for somebody else to go through on a second or third or even 50th try. So let's create a space or the opportunity, not necessarily a program, but just generally a consciousness that people are allowed to make mistakes, and many of those mistakes that they made and we castigate and criticize and mock and laugh at them for were the mistakes that made the way for you to be able to raise this enormous amounts of money that everybody's happy about and make such progress in the industry, and be all that you think you are and all you actually are today.
Amazing. Thank you, Josh, for that. And thank you very much for being on the show. It's been an exciting conversation with you.
Yeah, I mean, it's a pleasure. I feel like I've had the longest, probably I've talked too much. So, yeah. But yeah, great to be on. Thank you, Kalakwa. It's a brilliant show, by the way.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is amazing. And thank you once again for being on the show. And thank you, everyone, for listening. Feel free to share this episode with your friends. And Keep the good reviews coming and see you next time. Bye bye.